Coming up on the Civil Discourse, world-renowned public philosopher and Harvard University professor Michael J. Sandel discusses his book, The Tyranny of Merit: What's Become of the Common Good, along with his views on college admission and the dignity of work.
Humility is one of the great missing civic virtues of our time. Because when we recognize the role of luck, when we recognize our indebtedness for our success, then it's easier to see ourselves in other people's shoes.
Hello and welcome to the Civil Discourse. I'm Paula Marantz, Cohen, Dean of the Pennoni Honors College and Professor of English at Drexel University, speaking to you from my home in Center City, Philadelphia during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, my guest is Michael Sandel, who has been called our country's most important living philosopher. Professor Sandel has taught political philosophy at Harvard since 1981. Where his course on justice is among the university's most popular. Dr. Sandel was educated at Brandeis and at Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He is the author and editor of many books on the most important issues of our time. His most recent book is titled The Tyranny of Merit: What's Become of the Common Good. Michael Sandel, welcome to the Civil Discourse.
Good to be with you, Paula.
So when we think of a philosopher, we think of an ivory tower sort of intellectual. However, you have spent most of your career in the public sphere, and you've actually written about this notion of public philosophy. And I wonder if you talk for a moment about what you mean by that and what it is that propelled you to become a public philosopher.
Well, I came late to philosophy as a subject. But I knew I was interested in politics. I always followed politics and thought I might maybe go into politics or become a political journalist. And then in graduate school, I began studying philosophy and I became hooked and never quite emerged. But I always wanted to connect philosophy to the world, to illuminate the lives that we lead, the arguments that we have in public discourse. So the subject I've been teaching and writing about for some years now is moral and political philosophy. I see them as continuous, really, because I take my subject to be, how should we live together? And part of answering that question requires engaging with famous philosophers of the past. But part of that question involves listening and attending to the debates we have every day in politics and in our everyday lives. And so I see public philosophy and engaging the public with philosophical ideas as central to what I do.
So I want to talk about your new book, The Tyranny of Merit. And you started by discussing college application scandals that have occurred recently. But also about, and I know this from my own experience and that of my friends, the frenzy associated with applying to college for certain segments of the population. And one of the things you say that I think has great resonance is that this competitiveness for elite entry into college is bad for the winners as well as the losers. And I wonder if you would elaborate on that.
There is a frenzied, almost panicked season every year. In fact, the adolescent years of those from families, typically from the top 20 or 30% of the population, but from those families that aspire to send their kids to competitive colleges and universities, the adolescent years have become a stress-strewn, high-pressured, meritocratic gauntlet of competitiveness. So much so that by the time students reach us, and perhaps you've seen this as well.
I have seen this.
They are so, they've been wounded by this meritocratic gauntlet in a couple of ways. First, we're seeing more and more mental health challenges, depression, anxiety, and an epidemic of perfectionism, wanting to please one's parents and teachers and counselors and admissions committees. But a further effect of this is that this habit of hoop jumping and credential collecting is hard to break. And so it converts the college years too often into yet another competitive scramble, rather than as a time for exploration, for reflecting on what matters. Though, of course, a great many people are excluded in this competition. They don't have the advantages of supportive families and SAT prep courses and special tutoring that the winners, though they be wounded winners, have. And so much of the book shows how the tyranny of merit, as I call it, bears down upon those who don't win out in a competitive meritocratic society, who aren't equipped to get the high SAT scores that enable them to win admission to competitive four-year colleges and universities. Yeah. And how, as a result, there is growing resentment, a deepening divide between winners and losers.
After all, when we think about the American dream, the Horatio Alger rags to riches story, the pull yourself up by the bootstraps edict that we think of as so American and so allowing people with talent and grit and industry to make their way. And that's often been the comparison we've had to our own, to the detriment of Europeans who are so bound in by the class structure. You take issue with that. And in fact, I think that you make a point that in Britain, which is a far more class-bound society than America, in some ways, there may be more mobility or more sort of freedom to express the self than in this meritocratic society that we live in here. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, there are two problems with meritocracy that I describe in the book. One of them is that we don't live up to the meritocratic principles we proclaim. Just as you say, Paula, we've long comforted ourselves, consoled ourselves as Americans, that yes, there may be vast inequalities of income and wealth in this country. More so, typically, than in most European democracies. But we tell ourselves, inequality doesn't matter so much in a society where everyone who works hard can rise. No one in America is consigned to the class of his or her birth. That's what we told ourselves. And those Europeans, they have to worry more about inequality because those are immobile societies, little chance to rise. So the first problem is that this comforting picture no longer fits the facts on the ground. In America, it is not easy to rise, it turns out, one generation to the next. The chance of someone who's born in the bottom fifth of the income scale rising as an adult to the top fifth is about one out of 10 or 15, depending on the study, and the studies vary. So that's one problem with meritocracy. We don't have a truly mobile society. But there's a further problem, a further question, and that's this. Suppose we could one day truly remove all barriers to success so that everyone could compete fairly for jobs and social positions. If we had a perfect meritocracy, would we have a just society? Would it be a good society? I think there are reasons to doubt that it would be. Meritocracy has a dark side, and perhaps we can get into that, Paula.
Okay. Well, it's interesting. So on the one hand, meritocracy is not really meritocracy. On the other hand, we have to You have to interrogate it as an idea. And
Yeah.
this brings me to my question of, well, it seems to me that many of these sacred truths that, we accepted have been deconstructed, so to speak, over the past maybe 30 years, accelerated in the last 10. So things like truth and objectivity, the idea of fake news that has arisen, the idea of heroic myths of founders of this country, for example, and this pervasive skepticism. I wonder if you would put merit in with those things, and whether this is part of a tendency to, well, because we're more interconnected, we're more informed, we have become more profoundly skeptical. And this is good, but it also seems to me to have a downside. Can you address that?
It is true that what I argue in The Tyranny of Merit does challenge certain complacent notions that we have about how to deal with inequality. And it does challenge the idea that if only we could enable everyone to rise as far as their efforts and talents will take them, as the familiar political slogan promises, then we would have a just society. I challenge that idea, not out of a general skepticism, but out of something very concrete about what's unfolded in recent decades. The divide between winners and losers has deepened, poisoning our politics, driving us apart. This has partly to do with the widening inequality of income and wealth in recent decades, but it's not only that. It has also to do, I think, with changing attitudes toward success, toward winning and losing. In recent decades, those who've landed on top have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and by implication, that those who struggle, those who've been left behind, have no one to blame but themselves. This attitude toward success, I call it meritocratic hubris of the winners. It leads credentialed elites in ways subtle and not so subtle to look down on those who haven't flourished.
Michael, hasn't that always been the case? I mean, I think the point that you make, that the disparity between the rich and the poor has widened, and with that has become a more aggressive sense of that, what you call, and I'm very taken with the word you use again and again, a smugness on the part of the elite. But nonetheless, that smugness was certainly very present in our society 30, 40, 50 years ago. Is it the fact that the rich and the poor have become, is that driving the fact that this smugness is now more offensive than it was before?
You're certainly right that smugness is not a new thing. The arrogance of the successful is not a new thing. In every society, those who land on top want not only to enjoy their success, but to believe that they deserve it, that they're entitled to it. But it takes a new shape, and has come to take a new shape over the past 4 decades, which have been a time of deepening inequality of income and wealth, but also a time when the main political project across the political spectrum has been to deal with the inequality that came about through globalization, not directly, not by changing the structure of the economy that generates the inequality, but indirectly, by telling people, if you want to compete and win in the global economy, if you're worried about wage stagnation and job loss, here's what you do. Go to college, get a 4-year college degree. What you earn, this is the message that we've been given in recent decades. What you earn will depend on what you learn. You can make it if you try. So we have responded to this inequality, not directly, but by offering individual upward mobility through higher education. And the role of higher education is key, and it's distinctive, because we've made higher education into the arbiter of success in a meritocratic society. The problem is Most Americans don't have a four-year college degree. Nearly 2/3 don't. So it's folly to have created an economy that sets as a necessary condition for dignified work and a decent life a four-year degree that most Americans don't have. So this reliance on education and mobility as the answer to inequality generates a powerful sense among those who get credentialed and who rise. I deserved it. My success is my own doing.
Okay, I agree with you there. And I want to now shift to remedies and the way in which you address them in your book and the issue of the dignity of work. And you talk about the need to create a sense of dignity in work, the Aristotelian sense of flourishing that needs to infuse our society. The question there, though, is how do we do that? And my other piece is, as when you say not everybody needs college, but everybody needs to be educated, it seems to me, in the right way.
Yeah.
And whether it's college or it's in high school or wherever it is, that is not happening. And so how does that come about so that we can infuse in our population a sense of respect for everybody's work?
Right. Well, I think we need to do a number of things. First, we have to change the terms of public discourse to focus less on arming people for meritocratic competition and to focus more on the dignity of work, to put the dignity of work right at the center of our political debates. One thing that I think we need to do to renew the dignity of work is to invest far more than we do in those forms of learning on which most Americans depend to prepare themselves for the world of work. I'm thinking of state colleges, two-year community colleges, and vocational and technical training. We woefully underinvest in these areas. But it's not only a matter of money. It's also a matter of esteem, of honor and recognition. Because part of what's gone wrong with the dignity of work, part of what fuels the legitimate grievances of many working people, is the sense that the work they do is not valued and respected and recognized by the society. So that would be a first step. I think we also have to provide more occasions for voice, a genuine voice by working people. We've so emphasized credentialism in higher education that today there are very few, about 2/3 of Americans do not have a four-year college degree. Only about 2% of members of Congress do not have a college degree. There are only 2 or 3% who have any background to do with manual labor or work in the traditional sense, even though half the population works in those fields. So we have essentially excluded the majority of Americans, those who lack a four-year degree, from representative government. And I think that we overlook the sense in which that we have excluded and failed to respect and recognize the role of work. This may be changing with the pandemic.
Right. Don't you feel that the problem, though, is in education, not just vocational education?
No.
We need the so-called elites to understand what the, have a civic education or
Right.
an education in virtue. And
Right.
so, I mean, everyone, not just the elites.
Not just elites.
Somehow this has to be done with a sense of real conviction and with a sense that this is more than just looking down from a position of self-righteousness on
That's right.
others, which is what I think has become more reflexive in our society today.
Yes, I think that part of any project to renew the dignity of work requires a broad-based civic education of a kind that we are failing to provide now. We need to do a better job of civic education, as you mentioned, for the so-called winners, for those who attend four-year colleges and universities. We need to do a better job of equipping them with the habits and the civic virtues of reasoning together about hard ethical questions, questions of values, even where we disagree. Civil discourse, which is dear to your heart and the subject of this program. We have to do a better job in colleges and universities of providing this kind of civic education, but that's not enough. We also have to ensure that civic education is available and accessible to everyone, including in community colleges and in vocational and job training centers, including through trade unions. One of my favorite historic examples, Paula, is the Knights of Labor in the late 19th century. One of their demands was reading rooms in factories so that working people could take breaks and could read and inform themselves about public affairs so that they could have a voice, a meaningful say, could be equipped with the civic education they needed. We need to find ways to diffuse civic education and the ability to reason and argue about important public questions that matter throughout the society. The media certainly is not doing it properly. I think higher education needs to do better. This, I think, is a project that could renew not only the dignity of work, but also the character and the quality of our civic life.
One more question here. So you've written two other books that I've read at least parts of. One is The Case Against Perfection, Ethics in the Age of Genetic Engineering, and What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets. And all these two, plus your recent book, seem to be dealing with issues relating to achievement, value, merit, battling against a dehumanizing, desocializing tendency in our society. And I wonder if you think, as many authors do, that sometimes you're writing the same book again and again from different angles. Do you feel that's true, that you have one overarching drive in your thinking that gets expressed through various subject matter?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think there are some themes that run as threads through the recent books that you've mentioned. One theme is the emptiness of our public discourse. We have lost the capacity to reason together, to argue together about big ethical questions, questions of values, questions of justice and the common good and what we owe one another as citizens. We're not very good at arguing with those with whom we disagree, in part because we're not very good at listening in an active way, trying to understand what it is that animates those with whom we disagree. So that's been one theme. The other theme cuts closer to the subject of merit and success and how we think of ourselves, including those of us who manage to have some measure of success. There's a tendency for us to think of ourselves as self-made and self-sufficient. I am responsible for my own success. And we see this idea of self-making and self-sufficiency also in the embrace of a market society where the money people make is the measure of their contribution to the common good. We see it also in the drive to re-engineer human nature beyond health, to make ourselves over, to exert a kind of mastery. And this bid for mastery, this idea that we are self-made and self-sufficient, has been another theme running through my books. And toward the end of the new book, The Tyranny of Merit, I try to argue against meritocratic hubris by encouraging the successful, by encouraging us to reflect on the role of luck and good fortune in helping us on our way. This can be an antidote to the kind of meritocratic hubris that leads the credentialed to look down. And what we need is a certain humility. Humility is one of the great missing civic virtues of our time. Because when we recognize the role of luck, when we recognize our indebtedness for our success, then it's easier to see ourselves in other people's shoes, to look up upon those less fortunate than ourselves and to say and to think, there, but for the accident of fortune, or the grace of God, or the luck of the draw, go I. So a certain humility can open us to a sense of responsibility for the wider society and can point the way, maybe, this is my hope, Paula, to a less rancorous, more generous public life.
Wonderfully said. Luck, acknowledgement of luck, empathy, and humility are, I think, such key values, and you speak of them so eloquently. Thank you so much, Michael Sandel, for being with us today on the Civil Discourse.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.